I inherited my grandmother's house in East Tennessee when I was 26, a place I'd visited every summer as a kid but hadn't set foot in for nearly a decade. It sat at the end of a gravel lane that wound through dense hardwood forest, the kind of road that turned to mud when it rained and stayed that way for days, deep ruts carved by trucks that hadn't come through in years. The house itself was old, built sometime in the 30s by my great-grandfather, white clapboard gone gray with age and a tin roof that sang when it rained. The porch wrapped around 3 sides, supported by posts that had started to lean over the years, giving the whole structure a tired, sagging appearance, like an old man settling into his final years. My grandmother had died in February, alone in that house, and nobody found her for 3 days because the nearest neighbor was half a mile down the mountain and she'd stopped answering her phone weeks before. The lawyer who handled the estate said I could sell it if I wanted, that the land alone was worth something to developers looking to build vacation cabins for people from Knoxville or Chattanooga who wanted a taste of mountain life without actually having to live it. But I couldn't bring myself to do it. Not right away. The house had history, memories soaked into the floorboards and the smell of wood smoke permanently embedded in the walls, and selling it felt like erasing the last physical proof that my family had existed in this place for generations. So I moved in. Quit my job at the marketing firm in Nashville, packed what little I owned into the back of my truck, and drove the 3 hours east into the mountains, watching the landscape change from rolling hills to steep ridges covered in oak and poplar, the roads getting narrower and more winding until I turned onto that gravel lane and felt the forest close in around me like a door shutting. The first few weeks were busy enough that I didn't have time to think too much about being alone. I cleaned out my grandmother's things, sorted through boxes of photographs and letters and receipts from stores that hadn't existed in 40 years, repaired the porch steps that had rotted through in places, and tried to make the house feel like mine instead of hers. But the quiet got to me eventually. The kind of quiet you only get in places where human sounds are rare and the forest fills every silence with its own noise. Wind in the trees, branches scraping against the roof, the distant call of owls and the closer scurrying of things I couldn't identify moving through the underbrush. The porch swing had been there as long as I could remember, hanging from the ceiling on thick chains that had rusted to a deep orange-brown, the wood seat worn smooth by decades of use. My grandmother used to sit there every evening, watching the sun go down behind the ridgeline, a glass of sweet tea in her hand and her Bible open on her lap even though I don't think she ever actually read it. The swing had been her place, her ritual, and even after she was gone I found myself drawn to it, sitting in the same spot she had, feeling the wood still shaped to her body instead of mine. It was late August when it started, that brief window before fall when the days are still hot but the nights turn cool enough that you need a jacket after the sun sets. I'd gotten into the habit of making coffee after dinner and taking it out to the porch, sitting in the swing and listening to the forest settle into darkness, the cicadas winding down and the tree frogs starting up, the shift from day sounds to night sounds happening in layers that you only noticed if you paid attention. I was sitting there one evening, the swing creaking gently as I rocked it with one foot, when I heard the whispers. So faint at first that I thought it was just the wind moving through the leaves, that rustling, susurrant sound that could almost be mistaken for voices if you let your imagination run. But the air was still that night. Not a breath of wind. The trees stood motionless, their branches dark shapes against the deepening blue of the sky, and the chains on the swing hung straight and quiet. The whispers came from beside me. From the empty half of the swing where no one sat. Low and indistinct, like someone speaking just under their breath, the words blurred together into a murmur that slid through the humid air like oil on water. I stopped rocking, my foot pressed flat against the porch floor, and I listened, my coffee cup halfway to my mouth, the liquid inside going cold. At first I couldn't make out any words. Just the sound of voices, multiple voices maybe, overlapping and weaving together in a pattern that felt almost conversational, like listening to people talk in another room through a closed door. My heart started beating faster, that instinctive alarm response kicking in even though I couldn't identify any immediate threat. I was alone. I knew I was alone. I'd locked the gate at the end of the lane when I came home, and there was no one else on this stretch of mountain except old Mr. Hewitt a half-mile down, and he hadn't left his house in years. I leaned closer to the empty space beside me, straining to hear, and the whispers seemed to respond, growing just slightly louder, the voices resolving into something more distinct. I heard my name. Not shouted or called out, but murmured, soft and familiar, the way someone might say it in greeting or recognition. Sarah. Then other names I recognized. My grandmother's name. My mother's. My grandfather who died before I was born. The names of people who'd lived in this house, who'd sat on this porch, spoken in tones that carried a strange intimacy, like whoever was whispering knew them personally, had shared space with them. The words were still jumbled, fragments of sentences that didn't quite connect, but underneath the confusion there was something else. An urgency. A need. The kind of tone you hear in someone's voice when they're trying to convince you of something important, when they need you to understand and you're not quite getting it. My hands had started to shake. I set the coffee cup down on the porch floor, the ceramic clinking against the wood, and the sound seemed unnaturally loud in the stillness. The whispers paused for a moment as if acknowledging the noise and then resumed, clearer now. I could make out phrases. Come sit. Stay a while. We've been waiting. The voices were gentle, almost kind, but there was something underneath the gentleness that made my skin crawl, something hungry and patient, like a trap disguised as an invitation. There was no wind. The chains on the swing hung perfectly still, not moving, not swaying, but I could feel motion beside me, a shifting weight that made the wood beneath me creak as if someone had just settled into the seat. The temperature dropped, not dramatically but noticeably, a cold spot spreading across the porch that had nothing to do with the evening air. I could see my breath now, faint wisps of condensation forming in front of my face, and underneath it all, I could smell something. Damp earth. Old fabric. The faint sweetness of decay. I wanted to stand up. Wanted to back away and put distance between myself and whatever was happening on that swing. But I couldn't move. Not because something was holding me there, but because some deep, irrational part of my brain was convinced that moving would be the wrong thing to do. That acknowledging what I was hearing, what I was feeling, would make it more real, would give it permission to become something worse. The whispers grew more insistent. Come closer. Join us. You belong here. The voices were layered now, speaking over each other, and I realized with a sick lurch in my stomach that I recognized some of them. My grandmother's voice, thin and reedy like it had been in her final years. My mother's voice, though she was still alive, living in Florida and probably watching television right now without the slightest awareness that something was using her voice on a porch 600 miles away. Other voices I couldn't place but that felt familiar in the way that family voices do, genetic echoes carried in cadence and tone. I found my voice finally, forced the words out through a throat that felt like it was closing. Who's there? It came out as barely more than a whisper itself, weak and trembling, and the moment I spoke the voices stopped. Complete silence. Even the tree frogs had gone quiet. The forest held its breath, waiting, and I sat frozen on that swing, my heart hammering against my ribs, waiting for whatever came next. The silence stretched out, thick and oppressive, pressing down on me like a physical weight. Then the whispers started again, but different this time. Not murmuring my name or speaking in fragments. Now they were having conversations. Old conversations. Things I'd heard years ago, sitting on this same porch with my grandmother, listening to her talk about her childhood or complain about the weather or tell me stories about people who'd been dead since before I was born. The words came back exactly as she'd spoken them, with the same pauses and inflections, as if someone had recorded them and was playing them back now, feeding them into the air around me. But it wasn't just her voice. I heard my own voice too, younger, the voice I'd had at 10 or 12, asking questions and laughing at things I couldn't remember. I heard my mother's voice talking about needing to fix the roof before winter. My uncle's voice, dead now for 15 years, complaining about the drive up the mountain. All of them layered together, conversations from different years and different people, overlapping and colliding into a cacophony of memory that shouldn't have been possible. And underneath it all, weaving through the familiar voices, were others I didn't recognize. Older voices. Rougher. Speaking in accents that were thicker, more mountain, using words and phrases that sounded like they belonged to a different century. I caught fragments. Talk of hard winters. Failed crops. Children who'd died young. The voices of people who'd lived on this land long before my family, who'd probably sat on this same spot or something like it, and who'd left their words behind like fingerprints. The swing was moving now. I could feel it, a gentle rocking motion that I wasn't causing, the chains creaking softly overhead with that rhythmic groan that had been the background music of every summer evening I'd spent here as a child. But I wasn't moving it. My feet were flat on the floor, my body rigid with fear, and the swing was moving on its own, swaying back and forth with the same steady rhythm my grandmother had used, the motion deliberate and practiced. I stood up. Finally broke through whatever paralysis had been holding me and stood up so fast the swing lurched backward, the chains rattling. The whispers surged, rising in volume and urgency, dozens of voices now all speaking at once, overlapping into a noise that was almost physical, pressing against my ears and making my head throb. Come back. Sit down. Don't leave. Stay with us. We're lonely. So lonely. Please. I backed toward the door, my hands fumbling behind me for the handle, my eyes locked on the swing as it continued to move, swaying gently in the space I'd just vacated. The seat looked empty. Nothing visible sitting there. But the motion was too consistent, too purposeful to be random. Someone was sitting there. Something. And it was waiting for me to come back. I got the door open and stumbled inside, slamming it behind me and throwing the deadbolt with shaking hands. Through the window I could see the porch, the swing still moving, and the whispers were still audible, muffled now by the glass and walls but not gone. They seeped through the screens, through the gaps around the window frames, filling the house with their presence, and I could feel them watching me, waiting to see what I'd do next. I turned on every light in the house. Living room, kitchen, bedroom, bathroom. Flooded the place with harsh electric brightness that pushed back the shadows and made everything look normal and mundane and safe. But I could still hear them. Fainter now, reduced to a background murmur, but persistent. They whispered through the walls, rose up through the floorboards, and every time the house settled or creaked, I jumped, convinced that the voices were getting closer, that they'd found a way inside and were spreading through the rooms like smoke. I didn't sleep that night. Sat in the living room with my back against the wall and a kitchen knife on the floor beside me, watching the windows and listening to the house breathe around me. The whispers came and went in waves, sometimes so faint I thought I'd imagine them, other times loud enough that I could make out individual words. My name. Invitations. Fragments of conversations I'd had or heard or dreamed. And always, underneath it all, that same patient urgency, like something that had been waiting a very long time and could wait a little longer. When dawn finally came, gray light seeping through the windows and turning the world from black to tired blue, the whispers stopped. Just faded away like they'd never been there, leaving behind a silence that felt almost worse because I knew it was temporary. I knew they'd come back. I went into town that morning, exhausted and jittery from too much coffee and no sleep, and I asked around. Carefully. Not wanting to sound crazy but needing to know if anyone else had experienced anything like what I'd heard. Most people just looked at me with that polite confusion you get when you've said something that doesn't quite make sense, but old Mrs. Calloway, who'd lived in the valley her whole 80-something years, gave me a look I didn't like. A knowing look. She told me some houses hold on to things. That porches, especially places where people sit and talk and spend time, they soak up words like wood soaks up water. And sometimes, if enough words get soaked in, if enough people pass through, the porch starts to remember. Starts to replay what it's heard. She said it was harmless mostly. Just echoes. But she also said I should be careful about sitting out there too long, especially at night, because sometimes the echoes get confused about what's past and what's present, and they try to pull the present back into the past where it belongs. I didn't know what to do with that. Didn't know if I believed it or if it was just an old woman's way of making sense of something that didn't have a rational explanation. But I knew I couldn't keep living in that house, not the way it was, not with the whispers waiting every evening for me to come back out and sit in that swing. I boarded it up. Used 2x4s and wood screws and covered the swing so completely that no one could sit in it even if they wanted to. The whole time I was working I could feel something watching me, a weight in the air that made the back of my neck prickle, and I swear I heard whispers in the hammer strikes, voices rising and falling with each impact, pleading with me to stop, to let them out, to come back and listen. When I finished, the porch felt different. Quieter. But not silent. Never silent. At night, if the wind is right and I'm sitting inside with the lights off, I can still hear them. Faint murmurs seeping through the boards, filtered and distant but persistent. They whisper my name sometimes. Ask me to come back. Promise me things I can't quite make out. And the swing, even boarded and bound, still creaks. Not often. Just occasionally. A single slow groan of chain and wood, like someone settling into a familiar seat, making themselves comfortable for a long wait. I tell myself I'll sell the house. That I'll pack up and leave and let someone else deal with whatever lives on that porch. But I haven't yet. Can't quite bring myself to do it. Because some part of me, the part that grew up visiting this place every summer and listening to my grandmother's stories and feeling connected to something older and deeper than myself, knows that the whispers are right. I do belong here. My voice is probably already mixed in with the others, caught in the wood and waiting to be played back for whoever comes next. And maybe that's not such a terrible thing. Maybe that's just how old places work, how they remember, how they keep the people who love them from disappearing entirely. But I don't sit on the porch anymore. Not at night. Not when the light is fading and the forest is settling into darkness and the boundary between what's real and what's remembered gets thin. I stay inside with the doors locked and the windows closed, and I try not to listen too hard when the wind picks up and carries sounds that might be voices through the screens. Because I know that if I listen long enough, if I lean in close enough, I'll hear something I recognize. Something that sounds like me. And I don't know what I'll do if that happens. If I'll be strong enough to walk away or if I'll finally give in and go back out there, sit down in that swing, and let the porch finish whatever conversation it started all those years ago with people I never knew but who left their words behind like an inheritance I didn't ask for but can't escape. The voices are always waiting, patient and persistent, drawing me closer with every faint rustle, every creak of chain, every whispered promise that this time if I just come back and sit down and listen, they'll finally tell me what they've been trying to say all along. And God help me, part of me wants to know. Part of me wants to go back out there and let the whispers wash over me and become part of whatever that porch is building from all the words it's collected over the decades. But I'm not ready yet. Not quite. So I wait. And they wait. And the swing creaks in the dark, empty but never quite alone, holding space for someone who hasn't arrived yet but will. Eventually. Because that's what porches do in places like this. They wait. And they remember. And when the time is right they call you home.